So you likely listened to the story of colonial Latin America in terms of the social structure and culture. So now the other part of the story is how politics changed and how the economy changed. So the conquerors, as they were called, came up with very little treasure. They thought they were going to find gold. They thought they were going to find mountains of treasure, but they didn't. So they wanted to be paid. So the crown, the king in Spain, decided that they would repay them with what the crown called the encomienda. So this encomienda system is a really important concept to know for understanding colonial Latin America. So that word encomienda, you might try to pronounce that so that it sticks in your mind, because it's really important. It is the labor system, besides slavery, that structured the economy of colonial Latin America. So Spaniards were given land and tribute in money as well as labor of the villagers on the land. In other words, the king might say, for example, Pierce County, okay, Pierce County is yours, and all the land in Pierce County is yours, and all the labor of everyone who happens to be living in Pierce County is yours as well. So many villagers, though, had been paying tribute to the Aztecs, for example, or also to the Incas, if we're talking about Peru and South America, but it wasn't exactly the same kind of thing. It was very close to slavery. We don't want to confuse it with the term slavery because that's very specific, but it was a very onerous system. The other thing that's important to know about the encomienda system is that it was awarded to Spaniards in perpetuity. In other words, excuse me. In other words, you were awarded it. You could hand it down to your son, who could hand it down to his son, who could hand it down to his son. So forever and ever, these people owned this. In return, in theory, the encomendero, the person who held the encomienda, was supposed to educate and Christianize the Native Americans who lived on the land. However, the reality of it was that there was extreme exploitation. Very little education took place, mainly abuse. Here we have a drawing of punishment from a Spaniard to a Native American being helped by another Native American. An example of working the land. An example of the mistreatment by Spaniards of Native Americans. You can see the brutality that is being demonstrated in this drawing. This is another drawing, an indigenous drawing, explaining the kinds of work that people did, which was weaving, for example. Agricultural work was common. And mining also. Mining was a big part of what the indigenous did for the Spaniards. So this kind of abuse took place immediately in the early 1500s. But a particular Spanish priest, de las Casas, argued to the crown that there needed to be some pushback on how the indigenous were being treated by the encomenderos. So the crown agreed that there would be these new laws, which is what they were called, the new laws, that were enacted in 1542, which said that the natives would be considered free, not slaves, that the encomenderos could no longer demand free labor, but they had to pay. Tribute was still to be paid by the indigenous, but again, they were to receive wages. Labor in the mines was discouraged, which of course seems like a very weak statement. It was. And here's the important piece. Encomiendas lasted only the lifetime of the first encomendero, so they couldn't be passed down. In addition, the new laws said that public officials and clergy couldn't hold encomiendas. So the encomenderos really fought this. The new laws were weakly enforced because, remember, they're coming from Spain all the way to Latin America, where there was very little infrastructure. So the laws were revised finally in the later 1540s to say that they would last 2 generations. So the whole system within which the encomienda worked was called mercantilism. This is another important term to understand the economic structure. The role of the colony was to support Spain, so Spain could amass money, essentially, gold bullion. Imports and exports were controlled by Spain, and so all the excess was traveling right back to Spain. Here's a drawing of the Spanish fleet as they were hauling silver from the New World back to Spain. Because there was so much money coming from the Americas, piracy was very common in the 17th century, and Spanish ships were there to be raided, according to the French and the English. Spain also, besides getting silver, got other raw materials from America, from the Americas, I should say. Besides silver, there were different agricultural kinds of goods. Silver, though, was the most important. Labor tribute was common, especially in the mines in South America, in Peru. And those mines in Potosí, which is a town that currently is in Bolivia, located in the current Bolivia, produced almost 23,000 metric tons of silver. So it really changed the economy of Europe. Colonial Mexico also produced much of the silver. The problem with silver, though, was that Spain used it to buy manufactured goods from Northern Europe. So what happened was, rather than innovate and learn how to manufacture goods, Spain was the rich guy on the block. And so the people in Spain just bought manufactured goods, and there wasn't that kind of entrepreneurial sense, invention, that led to manufacturing development that happened in the Northern European colonies. One of the interesting pieces is that Spanish winemakers pushed to not have wine grapes grown in the Americas because they didn't want to have competition. Internally in Latin America, though, most of the people living there worked in agriculture. All of the indigenous worked in agriculture. They produced corn and wheat and livestock, and these agricultural items were then sent to the cities within Latin America to feed them. So that's the economic structure of Latin America during the colonial period. The political structure of Latin America started when the Crown created a government specifically for New Spain because the encomenderos were gaining too much power. The Crown thought, well, these men, and they were all men, who had these encomiendas began to think that they were in charge, and the Crown thought, no, we're in charge. So the Crown formed what was called the Council of the Indies, which was formed in 1524. It was made up of high-ranking judges. They also created, in Latin America, a government. They created what was called an audiencia, which was a council of 3 judges to oversee not just the judicial, as we would think of what judges would do, but also they had the executive and legislative issues as well to take care of. And then they created the position of the viceroy, which is vice king, someone who reported directly back to the king. Now, the viceroy was responsible for a ton of stuff. He charged and he collected taxes. He dispersed the taxes to Spain and to Latin America. He was in charge of the construction of public works. He was in charge of police order, the defense of the realm. He also supported the church. He was supposed to protect the indigenous. He was constrained in his power, though, by the church. Remember, if you've listened to the cultural discussion, the church had a great deal of power. So, by the end of each of the viceroy's reigns, the king would send someone over to kind of evaluate how they did. So he, the viceroy, did not have complete power. He was to be checked, both by the church and then by the king. Now, one of the many problems with the viceregal system was that it wasn't very efficient. It started out that there were only 2 viceroys for all of Spanish America. They were in Mexico City and in Peru. And think of all the tens of thousands of miles of area that they had to be in charge of. So it didn't work out very well. One of the things that changed, though, in the 1700s, and this was very important in terms of changing European power, is a new dynasty became in charge of Spain, called the Bourbon dynasty. And they created more viceroys. So the other thing that the Bourbons did was they created more local officials in the government structure in Latin America. So that helped solidify things. So the structure we need to think of is not, everything wasn't meshing together. There was Spanish towns, there were indigenous towns, and these individual indigenous towns were completely self-governing except for taxes. They had to pay taxes to the Spaniards. Local Spanish officials collected taxes from Indian towns. They were the ones who were in charge of these local Spanish officials' forced labor, which you saw pictures of just previously. Spanish towns had town councils, like we think of them, and they were in charge of everything, the markets, the economy, public safety, that kind of thing. The Bourbon reforms that took place were an answer to the big problems of the Habsburg dynasty, which was in charge of Spain and therefore Latin America for the first 200 years. But by the 1700s, the Bourbons came in and made the changes that I talked about earlier and restructured the government and restructured the economy and really tried to make the colonies more efficient, because the colonies were not very efficient. And by efficient, what the Spanish crown wanted was the most money possible. So they sent someone to New Spain to evaluate the system, José de Galvez. He traveled around Mexico to evaluate the economic and political systems. There he is, very serious-looking guy. He was very powerful because he was the one person who was going to report back to the king. So he was responsible for most of the reforms that occurred after 1765. A state monopoly on tobacco, on alcohol, on flour. He reformed the army, reformed local government. He created different levels in the army that hadn't been there before. He also expelled the Jesuits from New Spain. He thought that the Catholic Church had too much power, which it did, as you will recall from the discussion of culture. It had a lot of land, it had a lot of money, and it controlled education. The government lowered taxes, which people liked. All of these changes did increase the crown revenue from $6 million to $12 million. Silver production increased because of these changes. And so the government, by the time of independence, which was around the 1820s, it was a little bit different for each area in Latin America, but they all kind of became independent in the same couple of decades. So by that time, the economy was working fairly well. So one of the things for you to think about is, how did this colonial economy work? And did the colonial economies of the other colonial areas that we're looking at, did they work the same, or did they work differently? And then the question is, why might those similarities or differences exist?